By the time my husband finally realized I knew, it was already too late for him to do anything about any of it. The divorce filing was already prepared. The evidence was already documented, dated, and verified. And the affair he thought was his secret advantage had already, quietly, cost him his job. My name is Vanessa. I'm 37 years old, and 8 months ago, I discovered my husband, Richard, was having an affair with a woman on his own team at work, someone 11 years younger than him, someone whose promotion he'd personally recommended 6 months into their relationship, someone he'd taken on 4 separate, business trips, using our shared credit card and his company's own travel budget. I want to tell you up front that what I'm about to describe isn't some dramatic act of destruction. I didn't slash his tires or post his secrets on social media or do anything that would have made me the villain of my own story, or worse, exposed me to legal consequences of my own. What I actually did was quieter, more patient, and, in the end, considerably more devastating to him than anything impulsive could have been. I simply became smarter, faster, and better prepared than he ever imagined I could be, while he was still congratulating himself on how well he thought he was hiding everything. This is the story of the 6 weeks between discovering the affair and confronting him with it, and everything I built, quietly, during that exact window he assumed I knew nothing about. Richard and I had been married for 12 years, and for most of that time, I would have described our marriage, honestly, as a genuinely good one. We'd built a comfortable life together, a house we both loved, 2 kids in middle school, careers that supported each other reasonably well, the kind of ordinary, functional partnership that doesn't always look exciting from the outside but that had, until recently, felt entirely solid from the inside. Richard worked as a regional director at a mid-sized logistics company, a role that had grown considerably in scope and travel over the preceding 2 years as the company expanded into new markets. I'd noticed, over that same period, an uptick in his work trips, a detail I'd attributed entirely to the company's genuine, ongoing growth, never once suspecting it might be serving a purpose beyond the professional one he described to me. I want to be honest that nothing about our marriage's daily texture, in the months before I discovered any of this, struck me as obviously wrong. Richard was, if anything, slightly more attentive during that period than usual, a detail I now understand as likely guilt-driven overcompensation, though at the time it simply read as a genuinely good stretch in an already stable marriage. We'd built our life together deliberately, over more than a decade, a house in a good school district we'd saved for years to afford, a rhythm of family dinners and weekend activities with our kids, a small but genuine circle of friends we socialized with regularly as couples. I worked as a marketing manager for a regional healthcare company, a job I found genuinely fulfilling and that gave me my own financial independence throughout our marriage, a detail that would matter considerably more than I understood at the time once everything eventually came to light. I mention all of this because I think it's important to understand that I wasn't a woman who felt trapped or financially dependent when I eventually discovered what Richard had been doing. I was a woman who had built a genuinely full, independent life alongside a marriage I believed was equally full and honest. The first thread that eventually unraveled everything started with something almost comically mundane. I was reconciling our joint credit card statement for tax purposes, a task I handled every quarter without much drama, when I noticed a hotel charge in a city Richard had told me he'd never actually visited on his most recent trip. One he described to me, in detail, as taking place entirely in a different city 3 states away. I want to be honest that my first reaction was confusion rather than suspicion. I assumed, initially, some kind of billing error, or perhaps a connecting flight or a client dinner in a city adjacent to wherever he'd actually been. I nearly let it go entirely, the way you let go of 100 small, unremarkable inconsistencies in a long marriage, assuming there's always a boring, reasonable explanation you simply haven't heard yet. I remember, specifically, closing my laptop that first evening after noticing the charge, genuinely intending to simply forget about it and move on with my week. It was only sitting with my morning coffee 2 days later, the detail still quietly nagging at the edge of my thoughts despite my best efforts to dismiss it, that I found myself pulling the statement back up, unable to fully let the inconsistency go the way I'd initially told myself I would. It was cross-referencing that specific hotel charge against his calendar, purely out of idle curiosity rather than any real suspicion, that produced the detail I couldn't quite explain away. The hotel charge's date matched exactly with a business trip Richard had described to me as an internal team off-site, a detail that made a hotel stay in an entirely different city than the one he'd named considerably harder to attribute to simple travel logistics. That I want to describe one specific memory that resurfaced, uninvited, once that hotel charge started nagging at me, because I think it captures how these discoveries often work, not through one dramatic reveal, but through a small, previously innocent detail suddenly reading completely differently in hindsight. Roughly 2 months before I found the discrepancy in the credit card statement, Richard had come home from a business trip with a specific, unusual energy I'd noticed at the time but hadn't thought much of beyond registering it as simply a good trip, a successful set of meetings. He'd been almost giddy for several days afterward, a quality that felt, at the time, like a pleasant change of pace in an otherwise fairly routine stretch of our marriage. I remember specifically asking him what had made the trip go so well, and him giving a vague, general answer about great momentum with the new market expansion, an answer I'd accepted without a second thought. Sitting with the hotel charge discrepancy weeks later, that specific memory returned to me with an entirely different, considerably more unsettling weight. I understood, with a growing, uncomfortable certainty, that his unusual good mood likely had very little to do with market expansion at all. That I called the hotel directly, under the guise of confirming a reservation detail for an unrelated matter. A small, low-stakes lie I told myself was harmless given how uncertain I still was about what I was actually looking for. The reservation, the front desk representative confirmed, had been booked for 2 guests, a detail our joint credit card statement single-line item had given no indication of at all. I didn't push further on that call, unwilling to raise more direct questions I wasn't yet prepared to have answered. But that single detail, 2 guests, on a trip Richard had described to me as an internal team offsite in an entirely different city, sat with me for days afterward, refusing to resolve into any of the innocent explanations I kept trying to construct for it. I found myself, over the following week, doing something I never imagined I'd need to do in my own marriage, quietly, carefully cross-referencing Richard's actual calendar entries against his company's org chart, which I had some passing familiarity with from occasional work events, looking for any name that might explain a second guest on a trip he described as involving only his immediate team. It was there, scrolling through a company directory Richard had once shown me on his own laptop months earlier, that I found her, Ashley, a junior account manager on Richard's team, promoted, according to a company announcement I found archived online, roughly 6 months into what I would eventually confirm was the actual timeline of their affair. I remember the specific, cold sensation of finding her name and photo in that company directory, a genuine stranger to me despite apparently having occupied a significant, secret place in my husband's life for months by that point. I sat with her photograph on my screen for a long time that evening, studying a face I had absolutely no prior context for, trying to reconcile the ordinary, professional headshot in front of me with the considerably more complicated role I now suspected she'd been playing in my own marriage. That I want to be honest about the specific, methodical process I went through over the following several weeks, because I think it matters for understanding exactly how deliberately I approached everything that followed, rather than reacting in the moment the way I initially might have expected myself to. I didn't confront Richard immediately. I understood, almost instinctively, that a premature confrontation would only give him the opportunity to construct a plausible denial, destroy whatever evidence existed, or simply become more careful going forward, none of which would actually serve my own interests in eventually understanding, and responding to, the full scope of what was actually happening. Instead, I spent those weeks quietly building a complete, documented timeline, every business trip over the preceding 8 months, cross-referenced against credit card statements, hotel confirmation emails I found forwarded to a personal account he apparently thought I'd never think to check, and, eventually, a set of text messages I discovered on a shared family tablet Richard had, at some point, absent-mindedly logged into using the same cloud account linked to his phone, a detail I'm certain he never intended to happen, and that gave me considerably more direct insight into the relationship's actual timeline and nature than I'd expected to find at all. I remember the specific evening I found that tablet still logged into his account, a genuine accident on his part rather than anything I deliberately engineered, and the very real, uncomfortable moral question I sat with before actually reading through what I found there. I want to be honest that I hesitated, for a considerable time, over whether reading those messages crossed some line of my own, even given everything I already suspected. I ultimately decided that whatever discomfort I felt about that specific method of discovery was considerably outweighed by my own legitimate need to understand the full truth of what was happening in my own marriage, a conclusion I've never fully second-guessed since, even accounting for the specific, uncomfortable nature of how I came to find that particular piece of evidence. By the end of that research, I had a complete, dated record spanning 8 months, for separate trips involving hotel stays for 2, a promotion Richard had personally advocated for roughly 6 months into the relationship, and, critically, several instances where company travel funds and a company credit card had been used to cover expenses for what was, by any reasonable definition, a personal relationship rather than legitimate business activity. I want to describe the specific, methodical way I organized all of this, because I think the process itself mattered as much as the underlying discovery. I built a single, comprehensive spreadsheet, cross-referencing every trip date against hotel confirmations, credit card charges, calendar entries, and the specific text messages I'd found, creating a timeline so thorough and internally consistent that I could trace, almost day by day, the exact progression of the affair from its apparent beginning through to the present moment. I remember finishing that spreadsheet late one night, sitting alone at our kitchen table long after Richard had gone to bed, and feeling a strange, unexpected calm settle over me once the full picture was finally laid out clearly in front of me, a calm that surprised me considerably more than the anger or grief I'd expected to feel at that particular stage of the process. That I retained an attorney during that same window, a careful, direct woman named Patricia Alvarez who specialized in high-asset divorce and family law, roughly 3 weeks after my initial discovery, once I had enough documented evidence to have a genuinely informed, strategic conversation about my actual legal position rather than simply reacting emotionally to what I'd found. Patricia explained, in our first consultation, that the specific timeline and documentation I'd already assembled put me in an unusually strong position compared to most of her clients navigating a similar discovery. Because I'd gathered this evidence quietly, before Richard had any reason to suspect I knew anything, I had the significant advantage of being able to plan my next steps deliberately, rather than reacting defensively to a situation Richard already understood and had likely already begun preparing for on his own end. She walked me through the specific mechanics of how this evidence would likely affect our state's approach to dividing marital assets, given that our state considered marital misconduct in certain financial contexts, particularly where marital funds had been demonstrably used to support an affair, a detail she said could meaningfully affect both the division of our assets and potential spousal support calculations, since courts generally take a dim view of one spouse using shared financial resources specifically to fund infidelity. Patricia also asked me, during that first meeting, a question I hadn't fully anticipated but that ended up shaping much of our strategy going forward, what I actually wanted the outcome of all of this to look like, beyond simply documenting what had happened. I told her, honestly, that I wanted 2 things specifically: a fair, even favorable financial resolution given everything Richard had done, and a genuine, documented accountability that extended beyond just our private marriage, given that he'd used company resources and his own professional position to sustain the affair. Patricia told me that second goal was less common among her clients than the first, but that it was entirely achievable given the specific nature of what I'd already uncovered, and that pursuing both simultaneously, rather than focusing exclusively on the divorce itself, would likely produce a considerably more complete resolution than either goal pursued alone. Patricia and I spent the following 2 weeks building what she described as a comprehensive, sequence strategy, one designed to ensure that by the time Richard understood I knew anything at all, every meaningful advantage I could secure would already be locked firmly into place. The plan itself unfolded across several coordinated fronts. Patricia helped me formally document and preserve every piece of evidence I'd gathered in a way that would hold up cleanly to legal scrutiny, rather than relying on screenshots and personal notes alone. We opened an individual bank account and began, carefully and legally, moving my own separate income into it, ensuring I had immediate, independent financial resources the moment I needed them, entirely separate from any joint accounts Richard might otherwise have access to or control over. Patricia was careful to explain the specific legal boundaries of what I could and couldn't do during this preparation period, cautioning me directly against anything that might be construed as improperly depleting marital assets myself, even while working to secure my own reasonable financial independence. She drew a clear, specific distinction between prudently protecting my own separate income, which was entirely appropriate, and attempting to move joint marital funds in ways that might later be characterized, unfavorably, as my own form of financial misconduct during the proceedings, a distinction I appreciated her making explicit, since I wanted my own conduct throughout this process to remain, in every respect, considerably more careful and above board than Richard's had been. I also made the decision, with Patricia's guidance, to consult separately with an employment attorney regarding the specific misuse of company funds I documented, understanding that this particular detail existed in a legally interesting overlap between our divorce and Richard's own employment, one that could produce consequences for him considerably beyond whatever happened in our own marital proceedings. I want to be honest about the specific, complicated emotional experience of executing this plan across those weeks, continuing to live alongside Richard, sharing dinners and ordinary domestic routines, while quietly building a comprehensive case against him he had no idea existed. It required a particular, sustained discipline I hadn't fully anticipated needing, the same discipline, I understood with a kind of grim irony, that he must have been exercising himself, for 8 months, hiding his own parallel life directly alongside our shared one. There were moments during those 6 weeks that tested my composure considerably more than others. I remember one specific evening, roughly halfway through the process, when Richard came home in an unusually good mood, mentioning offhandedly that Ashley had just been promoted again, a detail he shared with the same casual, professional tone he might have used discussing any other colleague's career progress. I remember sitting across from him at dinner that night, already holding the complete, documented timeline of their affair in a folder in my own home office, listening to him discuss her career with total, practiced normalcy and understanding, with a specific clarity, exactly how much sustained, deliberate effort maintaining that normalcy must have required from him for months. It gave me, oddly, a considerable amount of confidence in my own ability to maintain my own composure for the remaining weeks I still needed. That I want to spend some time on the specific employment consequence thread, because it became, in the end, one of the more significant elements of everything that eventually unfolded, and because I think it's worth understanding the actual mechanics of how it worked. Richard's company, like most mid-sized organizations of its type, maintained a formal policy governing romantic relationships between employees in a direct or indirect reporting relationship, a policy specifically designed to address exactly the kind of power imbalance inherent in a senior director dating, and subsequently promoting, a considerably more junior employee on his own team. Richard's relationship with Ashley violated that policy directly, a fact that existed entirely independent of our marriage and would have constituted a legitimate, documentable workplace violation regardless of whether I personally ever discovered it at all. The misuse of company travel funds and a company credit card to support personal travel for the relationship represented a separate, additional violation, a form of expense fraud that most companies, understandably, treat with genuine seriousness, given the direct financial and legal exposure it creates for the organization itself. My employment attorney explained that reporting this kind of violation, when supported by genuine, documented evidence rather than mere allegation, is something companies are generally obligated to investigate seriously, both to address the underlying misconduct and to protect themselves from their own potential liability, particularly given the specific power dynamic involved between a senior director and a junior employee he'd personally promoted. My employment attorney, a careful practitioner named Marcus Chen who specialized specifically in workplace investigations and corporate compliance, walked me through something I found genuinely clarifying about how these situations typically unfold from the company's own perspective. He explained that most organizations of Richard's company's size carry directors' and officers' liability insurance specifically designed to protect against exactly this kind of exposure, a senior employee's misconduct creating potential legal liability for the company itself, whether through discrimination claims from other employees who felt the relationship created an unfair promotion pathway, or through the more straightforward financial exposure of documented expense fraud. He told me that companies facing this kind of clear, well-documented risk typically move to address it swiftly and decisively, not necessarily out of any particular moral conviction, but simply because the alternative, allowing a known, documented violation to continue unaddressed, creates considerably more legal and financial risk for the organization than promptly investigating and resolving it. That I confronted Richard on a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after my initial discovery, once every piece of Patricia's plan was fully in place, the divorce filing prepared and ready, my own finances secured and separated, the employment complaint documented and prepared for formal submission. I laid the evidence out on our kitchen table, methodically, the same way I imagine he once laid out quarterly reports for his own team, the hotel records, the credit card statements, the promotion timeline, printed and organized in a way that left no meaningful room for the kind of vague, deflecting explanation he might otherwise have attempted. I watched him move through a familiar sequence: confusion, a brief, doomed attempt at minimization, and then, once the sheer comprehensiveness of what I'd assembled made any remain. Denial genuinely impossible, a slow, visible collapse into actual panic, considerably more acute, I think, than a simple confession of infidelity alone would have produced. He understood, looking at that table, that I wasn't simply confronting him with hurt feelings. I was presenting him with a fully built case, one that already extended well beyond our marriage into his own professional life. I told him, calmly, that I'd already retained an attorney, that divorce papers were already prepared, and that a formal complaint regarding his misuse of company funds and violation of his employer's relationship policy was already documented and ready for submission, a detail that visibly, immediately shifted the entire register of his panic from marital crisis into something considerably more existential regarding his own career. I remember, specifically, the moment his focus shifted away from the marriage entirely and onto the employment complaint, a shift I watched happen almost in real time across his expression. He asked, several times, in increasingly urgent tones, whether I could reconsider filing the workplace complaint specifically, seemingly more concerned in that moment about his career than about the marriage itself, a reaction that told me, more clearly than almost anything else that morning, exactly where his actual priorities had settled by that point. I told him, honestly, that the decision was no longer solely mine to reconsider. My own attorney had explained that once genuine evidence of expense fraud existed, failing to report it could, in certain circumstances, create complications of its own, and that I had no intention of suppressing documented misconduct simply to protect him from consequences he'd brought on himself. That I want to describe the specific, strange week that followed that Saturday morning confrontation, before the formal legal and employment processes had actually begun to unfold in any concrete way, because it represented its own distinct, difficult chapter in this entire experience. Richard moved out within 3 days, staying temporarily with a friend while we began the more formal, practical process of separating our shared life. That week felt, in some ways, considerably harder than the confrontation itself had been. The specific, mundane logistics of a marriage actually ending, dividing up which of us would keep which household items, explaining an initial, careful version of events to our children, fielding concerned calls from family members once word began, inevitably, to spread. I remember feeling, during that specific week, a kind of exhausted numbness that the more dramatic confrontation itself hadn't produced, as though the actual planning and execution of my strategy had used up a reserve of adrenaline and focus that simply wasn't available anymore once the confrontation was over and the slower, grinding work of actually dismantling a 12-year marriage began in earnest. The employment consequences, once the formal complaint was submitted, unfolded with a speed that surprised even me, though my employment attorney had cautioned me that companies facing this kind of clear, well-documented liability exposure often move considerably faster than most people expect once genuine legal risk becomes apparent to them. Richard's company launched a formal internal investigation within days, one that ultimately confirmed both the relationship policy violation and the misuse of company funds, given how thoroughly documented the underlying evidence already was by the time it reached their own investigators. Richard was terminated within 3 weeks, a resolution his company framed, in the formal termination documentation Patricia's office later obtained during our divorce proceedings, as directly tied to violations of both the company's conflict of interest policy and its expense reimbursement guidelines. Ashley, notably, was also terminated as part of the same investigation, a detail I found genuinely complicated to sit with, understanding that she, too, had made her own choices throughout this affair, while also recognizing the specific power imbalance inherent in her situation as the considerably more junior employee in a relationship with the director who directly influenced her own promotion. I don't know the full details of what happened to her afterward, and I made a deliberate decision not to pursue that information further once the professional consequences had run their course. I want to be honest that my feelings about Ashley's termination remain, even now, considerably more complicated than my feelings about Richard's. She made her own choices, certainly, and I don't think her junior position fully absolves her of responsibility for pursuing a relationship with a married, senior colleague. But I also recognize that the power dynamic between them was real and significant, and that Richard, as the senior party who directly influenced her career trajectory, bore a disproportionate share of the actual responsibility for how that relationship developed and was sustained. I've tried, in the months since, to hold both of those truths simultaneously, genuine accountability for her own choices, alongside a clear-eyed recognition that the power imbalance itself was real and mattered. The divorce itself, once formally filed, proceeded with the specific, considerable advantage Patricia had structured everything around from the very beginning, a comprehensive, well-documented case establishing both the affair's timeline and the misuse of marital financial resources to support it, evidence that meaningfully strengthened my position throughout the entire proceedings. Patricia successfully argued that the misused company funds, while not technically drawn from our own marital assets directly, nonetheless represented Richard's use of professional resources and reputation specifically to sustain the affair, a detail she used to support a broader argument about marital misconduct that ultimately factored into the settlement negotiations, resulting in a division of our actual marital assets that Patricia described as meaningfully more favorable to me than what a more contested, evenly balanced case might have produced. She explained that Richard's own attorney, upon reviewing the full scope of documented evidence, had advised him fairly early in the process that contesting the underlying facts would likely prove both expensive and ultimately unsuccessful, a recommendation that pushed the entire proceeding toward negotiated settlement considerably faster than the more contentious, drawn-out litigation Patricia had initially prepared me to expect as a real possibility. I want to be honest that the financial outcome, while significant, was never actually the part of this entire process that mattered most to me. What mattered more was the simple, complete reversal of the specific power imbalance I'd felt in those first disorienting days after discovering the affair, the shift from feeling like a blindsided, powerless victim of a secret I hadn't known existed, into someone who had methodically, patiently built a position of genuine strength before Richard ever understood the ground beneath him had already shifted entirely. Patricia and I finalized the actual settlement roughly 5 months after the divorce was formally filed, a timeline she described as considerably faster than average for a case of this complexity, largely because the strength and thoroughness of my documented evidence gave Richard's own attorney very little practical room to contest most of the underlying facts. I remember sitting in Patricia's office the day we finalized the terms, reviewing a settlement that secured my ability to keep our family home, a division of retirement accounts that Patricia described as unusually favorable given typical outcomes in our state, and a level of spousal support that reflected the court's genuine consideration of how marital resources had been used to support the affair. I didn't feel triumphant sitting in that office, exactly. I felt, more than anything, a quiet, settled relief that the specific, sustained work of those 6 weeks had actually produced the outcome I'd hoped it might. That I want to address, carefully, how I navigated this entire process alongside our 2 children, both in middle school and old enough to notice, eventually, that something significant had changed in our household, even though I made deliberate efforts to shield them from the specific details throughout the 6-week period I was quietly building my case. I told them, once the divorce was formally underway, an age-appropriate but honest version of what had happened, that their father had made choices that hurt our family, and that I was taking the steps necessary to protect all of us going forward. I made a specific, deliberate choice not to frame anything to them in terms of revenge or retribution, understanding that however satisfying that framing might have felt to me personally, it wasn't a framework that would serve their own understanding of their parents' relationship, or their relationship with their father going forward, in any healthy way. My older child, 13 at the time, asked me directly, during one particularly difficult conversation, whether I had done anything to get back at their father, a question I answered honestly by explaining that I had simply made sure the truth about what happened was documented and known by the people who needed to know it, and that the actual consequences that followed were the natural, predictable result of choices their father had made himself, rather than anything I had done to manufacture punishment beyond simply refusing to stay silent. My younger child, 11 at the time, processed everything considerably differently, focusing far more on the practical, immediate questions of daily life, which house they'd primarily live in, whether they'd still see both sets of grandparents regularly, whether our dog would stay with me. I found those more concrete, manageable questions, in their own way, easier to navigate than the more abstract, emotionally loaded questions my older child raised, though I made a deliberate effort to remain equally patient and honest with both of them, understanding that each child needed something slightly different from me during that period, and that neither approach to processing this news was more or less valid than the other. I want to share something Patricia said to me during our final meeting, once the settlement had fully concluded, because it stayed with me more than almost anything else from this entire process. She told me that in her considerable experience handling cases like mine, the clients who came out of a divorce feeling most genuinely whole afterward weren't necessarily the ones who secured the largest financial settlements, but the ones who'd approached the entire process with the same kind of clear-eyed, methodical composure I'd maintained throughout, understanding the difference between pursuing genuine accountability and simply seeking to inflict maximum pain on someone who'd hurt them. She said she'd seen plenty of clients pursue the second path, understandably, given how raw and furious the initial discovery of betrayal often leaves people, but that those cases, in her experience, tended to leave clients feeling considerably less settled and resolved once everything concluded, regardless of the actual financial outcome. I've thought about that observation often in the months since, understanding that the specific patience and discipline I'd maintained throughout those 6 weeks, and the months of legal proceedings that followed, wasn't just a strategic advantage in building my case. It was, in its own way, the actual foundation of how genuinely at peace I've felt since everything concluded, in a way I don't think a faster, more purely emotional response would have given me. I don't tell this story to suggest that everyone discovering infidelity should respond with the same methodical, 6-week strategic process I happen to pursue. Every marriage, every discovery, every set of circumstances is different, and I don't think there's a single correct emotional or practical response to betrayal of this kind. What I would say, if there's something practical worth taking from this, is that the instinct to react immediately, however understandable and however satisfying it might feel in the moment, is rarely the instinct that actually serves your own long-term interests best. Patience, documentation, and genuinely informed legal guidance gave me something considerably more valuable than any immediate, emotional confrontation could have, a position of real, demonstrated strength, built quietly, on my own terms, before anyone else understood what I was actually doing. I don't know exactly what Richard's life looks like now, beyond the broad outlines that occasionally reach me through our children or mutual acquaintances. I know he's still working through the professional fallout of his termination, still navigating whatever comes next in a career that took a significant, self-inflicted hit. I've made peace with not needing to know considerably more than that. I heard, secondhand through a mutual friend roughly 6 months after the divorce finalized, that Richard had struggled to secure a comparable position at another company, given that background checks and industry reference calls occasionally surfaced enough general information about the circumstances of his termination to give prospective employers pause, even without the full, specific details ever being formally disclosed beyond his previous company's own records. I felt, hearing that update, a complicated mixture of feelings I hadn't fully anticipated, not quite satisfaction, exactly, but a kind of settled, quiet confirmation that consequences, once genuinely documented and pursued through legitimate channels, tend to follow a person considerably further than they might initially expect. My own life, in the months since, has been about building something entirely mine, financially secure, professionally stable, and, for the first time in longer than I fully realized, built on complete, unshakable honesty with myself about exactly what I want going forward. If this story affected you, or if you've ever had to quietly, methodically build your own strength before the people around you understood what you were actually capable of, I want to hear about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and more of what I've learned about reclaiming control on my own terms, every day.